His body lay untouched for 6 days, and it didn't rot. That was the first thing that made his men suspicious. The greatest conqueror they had ever followed didn't decay like a normal human being. Some called it divine, others called it poisoned. 12 days earlier, Alexander the Great was healthy. He held a massive banquet. He drank wine, laughed with generals, and spoke of invading Arabia. Then he clutched his stomach. Then he couldn't speak. Then he couldn't move. What happened over the next 12 days would leave an empire without a leader, a military without a direction, and a death that still has no confirmed cause over 2,000 years later. Some believed it was malaria. Others said typhoid fever. But as whispers turned into written accounts, suspicion grew that this was no natural death, that someone, or multiple people, planned it, that the world's most powerful man had been murdered. The theories would include a poisoned cup, a conspiracy inside his court, and a deadly plant that could kill slowly. So slowly it fooled everyone. Was it illness? Was it poison? Or was it something stranger? To understand what really happened, we have to go back, not just to the day of the feast, but to the very beginning of his life. What kind of boy grows up to become a god in his own mind and ends up dead in silence? Alexander was born in 356 BCE in Pella, the capital of Macedonia. His father was King Philip II, a respected military commander who united the Greek city-states under Macedonian rule. His mother was Olympias, a strong-willed princess from Epirus, who claimed descent from Achilles. From birth, Alexander was told he was destined for greatness. Philip was rarely home. He was either at war or expanding his empire. Olympias raised Alexander with intense attention. She filled his head with stories of heroes, gods, and glory. She told him he was not the son of Philip, but of Zeus himself. From a young age, Alexander believed he was not fully mortal. By the time he was 10, he had tamed a wild horse no one else could ride, a horse named Bucephalus. His father reportedly said, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." As a teenager, he was taught by Aristotle, not just philosophy, but science, ethics, politics, and strategy. Alexander was smart, curious, restless. He saw life as a battlefield where honor had to be seized, and he saw no limit to how far he could go. In 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated. Alexander was 20. Within 2 years, he crushed rebellions in Greece and launched a campaign into Asia. Over the next 10 years, he defeated the Persian Empire, marched into Egypt, reached the edge of India, and founded more than 20 cities, all before the age of 33. He never lost a single battle, but behind the victories were signs of instability. Alexander pushed his men past exhaustion. He claimed to be the son of a god. He executed former friends, and in Babylon, the heart of his empire, he surrounded himself with flatterers, drink, and suspicion. The empire was large, the enemies were many, and he had no clear heir. So when he suddenly fell ill and slowly began to die, his court split into silence. No one moved, no one asked, no one helped. They watched. But what kind of mind had Alexander developed by then? And who had helped shape it? Let's go back further, to the early influences that taught him to see conquest as a destiny. Alexander's mind was built deliberately. His education wasn't casual. Every lesson had a purpose. Every idea was tied to a vision of power. At age 13, his father hired Aristotle, the most famous philosopher in Greece, to personally tutor him. For 3 years, Alexander studied logic, ethics, zoology, medicine, geography, and politics. But Aristotle didn't just teach facts, he taught a worldview. One idea stood out: some men are born to rule, others are born to be ruled. Aristotle believed in hierarchy, and he made sure Alexander did too. Alexander studied Homer's Iliad like it was scripture. His copy was annotated by Aristotle himself. He slept with it under his pillow. He idolized Achilles, a warrior who lived for glory and died young. From early on, Alexander believed life should be short, brilliant, and legendary. Olympias shaped the other side of him. She fed him stories of divine birth, destiny, and betrayal. She told him he was meant to surpass both gods and men. At home, she was a dominant force, ruthless in politics. She likely poisoned rivals. She taught Alexander that trust was a weakness and paranoia was survival. From childhood, he watched his parents fight for control of the palace. Philip married other women. Olympias retaliated. Their home was full of spies, alliances, and assassins. Alexander learned early that power was not given. It had to be seized. He was trained physically as well. He studied swordplay, horseback riding, and battle formations. He endured brutal military drills, led exercises, and joined his first campaign at 16. He was praised by generals, respected by troops. By his late teens, he was already seen as a natural leader. He also developed intense self-discipline. He ate little, slept little, endured pain without complaint. This made his men trust him. They saw him suffer like they did, or more. But all this training came with a price. Alexander developed no patience for limits. He saw disagreement as betrayal. He began to believe his own myth. By the time he took the throne, he didn't just want to rule a country, he wanted to conquer the world. This mindset would drive every decision, including who he trusted, how he ruled, and what happened in his final days. But how did this belief in divine destiny collide with real power? The next step is to watch how a boy raised to be a god actually took the throne. In 336 before the Common Era, Alexander's father, King Philip II, was assassinated at a wedding ceremony. Philip was at the height of his power. He had just married a younger wife and secured alliances. But while entering the theater for the celebration, he was stabbed by one of his own bodyguards, a man named Pausanias. The killer was executed immediately, but the question of who ordered the killing was never answered. Some suspected Olympias, others blamed Alexander. Neither was proven. But what mattered was this: Philip was dead. And, at just 20 years old, Alexander became king. There was immediate unrest. Several Greek city-states saw Philip's death as a chance to rebel. Thracians and Illyrians challenged Macedonian control. Even Macedon's own nobles questioned if Alexander could hold power. He responded without hesitation. In a matter of months, he crushed all opposition. He rode into Thessaly, where the rebels surrendered without a fight. He pushed into the Balkans and reasserted control through force. In Thebes, when rebellion flared again, he ordered the city destroyed. Every house was razed. Over 6,000 people died. The rest were sold into slavery. No one challenged him after that. In 334 before the Common Era, just 2 years after becoming king, he crossed into Asia Minor with an army of 40,000 men. His goal was to defeat the Persian Empire, the largest power in the known world. His first major battle was at the Granicus River. He won. He continued to march east. Within 3 years, he defeated Darius III of Persia, claimed Babylon, and declared himself king of Asia. But Alexander didn't stop. He believed his mission wasn't complete until the whole world was under his rule. He called himself Basileus ton Basilian, King of Kings. He adopted Persian dress. He demanded that people bow before him. Some of his Greek officers began to question him, but he ignored them. To many, it looked like he wasn't just ruling like a king, he was ruling like a god. And in his court, where old friends were now kept at a distance, a new kind of danger was building. The kind that doesn't wear armor, but carries wine. But before the poison, before the silence, what cracks had already formed inside his rule? Alexander ruled more land than any man before him. But he had no plan for what came after. He had no legitimate heir, no confirmed successor, no written will. By the time he reached Babylon in 323 BCE, cracks in his empire had already begun to show. His closest general, Parmenion, was executed years earlier, along with Parmenion's son, Philotas, who had been accused of treason. No trial, no evidence. just elimination. Cletus the Black, the officer who once saved Alexander's life in battle, was stabbed to death by Alexander himself during a drunken argument. Alexander regretted it immediately, but the message was clear. Disagreement meant death. As he moved east, he began replacing Macedonian officers with Persian ones. This angered many in his army. Veterans accused him of going native, of betraying Greek identity. To calm dissent, Alexander arranged mass marriages between his generals and Persian noblewomen. But these were not romantic unions. They were political orders. Most ended in divorce after his death. The further Alexander pushed, the more isolated he became. Back in Macedon, old power centers like Antipater, the regent who governed Greece in Alexander's absence, were gaining strength. Antipater's position was both powerful and independent. He had influence, he had troops, and he had a son named Iolaus, who served as Alexander's personal cupbearer. In Babylon, the tension was visible. Alexander's old companions resented the new Persians. His mother wrote him letters full of warnings. Even Alexander began speaking less and drinking more. He hosted longer feasts. He trusted fewer people. Some said he was watching everyone. Others said he had stopped caring. He named no clear successor, only saying on his deathbed that the empire should go to the strongest. This created chaos. Factions formed, ambitions grew. Some saw opportunity, some saw danger, and among the inner circle, something happened that no one dared speak of directly. A silent move that would change the course of history. A banquet was held, wine was poured, and hours later, Alexander doubled over in pain. But this wasn't a quick death. It was slow. It was deliberate. And for 12 days, his body fought a battle no one could see. Alexander's conquest was built on discipline. But by the time he reached Babylon, it was held together by fear. The systems he created to control his empire weren't just administrative, they were personal. He ruled with a mix of admiration, ritual, and raw intimidation. At the center of his power structure was the companion cavalry, elite Macedonian soldiers who acted as both his bodyguards and enforcers. These men were not just fighters, they were tools of loyalty. Disloyalty meant death. After the conquest of Persia, Alexander began modeling parts of his rule on Eastern traditions. He adopted the Persian practice of proskynesis, a court ceremony where subjects bowed or even prostrated themselves before the king. This caused outrage among his Macedonian officers, who saw it as submission more fit for gods than men. But Alexander insisted. When they refused, he replaced them. He created new satrapies, local governorships across the empire, and placed Persian nobles alongside Macedonians. But these were carefully chosen. Governors who acted too independently were removed or executed. In one wave of purges, over 30 satraps were investigated. Several were killed. In Egypt and Babylon, religious temples were kept intact, but only if they declared Alexander divine. Those who resisted were quietly removed. In conquered cities, resistance was met with destruction. The most brutal example remained Thebes, where he ordered total annihilation. But across the empire, the message was the same: obedience or elimination. Inside his court, control was psychological. Alexander surrounded himself with flatterers and mystics. Dreams were interpreted, omens were read. Dissent was not just political, it was seen as heresy. Even personal relationships weren't safe. In Susa, Alexander married Roxana, but later forced dozens of his generals to marry Persian noblewomen as political gestures. These men had no choice. It was a performance, a staged show of unity over real trust. By the time he returned to Babylon in 323 BCE, Alexander's rule rested on a dangerous contradiction. He expected personal loyalty, but gave little in return. He drank heavily. He isolated himself. He planned more invasions into Arabia, possibly Carthage. But the soldiers were exhausted. His commanders were divided, and in the silence of that palace, he ruled not as a leader, but as a symbol too powerful to challenge. Untersamwunde, a poisoned cup, or a miscalculated dose, or an accidental slip in a court where everyone had something to gain. But what if the greatest danger didn't come from his enemies, but from those who once called him a friend? By the final year of his life, Alexander trusted almost no one. The men who had fought beside him for over a decade were being removed, exiled, or killed. Loyalty wasn't enough. Absolute obedience was required, and even that didn't guarantee survival. The most dramatic break came with Cletus the Black, a veteran officer and one of Alexander's oldest defenders. At a banquet in Samarkand, Cletus criticized Alexander's adoption of Persian customs. He reminded him of his father's achievements. He mocked the idea that Alexander was divine. Alexander, drunk and enraged, grabbed a spear and killed him on the spot. Accounts say Alexander wept afterward and refused food for days. But the damage was done. Everyone saw what the moment meant. No one was untouchable. Another key figure, Callisthenes, a historian and relative of Aristotle, publicly refused to perform proskynesis. He said it was fit only for gods, not men. Soon after, he was arrested. He died in captivity, possibly by torture or starvation. These weren't isolated events, they were signals. Inside the palace, Alexander began keeping his distance even from former confidants. Those closest to him began communicating through intermediaries. His meetings became smaller, more secretive. Guards rotated constantly. Even his relationships with family fractured. His mother Olympias, once his most trusted ally, was now hundreds of miles away in Epirus. She wrote to him frequently, warning him about Antipater, the regent in Macedon, and his growing power. Alexander reportedly received these warnings, but made no clear moves. Instead, tensions simmered. Antipater didn't wait. He sent his son Iolaus to Babylon, where he became Alexander's personal cupbearer. This role was no small task. The cupbearer was trusted with preparing and serving the king's wine. He stood beside him at every banquet. He controlled what entered the king's body. Later, after Alexander's death, Olympias would accuse Iolaus of delivering the poison. She would even desecrate his grave in revenge. But at the time, no one dared speak aloud. Everyone knew the circle around Alexander was shrinking. Paranoia filled the vacuum where friendship used to be. And when the illness began, the stomach pain, the tremors, the fever, none of those men lifted a hand to stop it. They watched, but the death itself wasn't quick. It was strange, slow, and filled with contradictions. What exactly happened during those final 12 days? On the night of May 29th, 323 before the Common Era, Alexander attended a banquet hosted by Medius of Larissa, a trusted companion. He drank heavily. Some sources say he consumed a large bowl of unmixed wine, then cried out in pain. Others report the pain came the next day. But what all accounts agree on is this: Alexander suddenly fell ill, and he never recovered. For the first 2 days, he complained of abdominal pain and fever. He continued to give orders, but his voice weakened. On the 3rd day, he could no longer stand. His limbs trembled. His speech became slurred. He stopped eating. By day 5, he could barely speak. By day 7, he was paralyzed. He was moved from one room to another, reportedly to keep him cool, or possibly to hide his deterioration from the troops. 12 days after the symptoms began, Alexander the Great, undefeated in battle, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, died. He was 32 years old. His doctors, some of the best in the empire, were powerless. They offered no diagnosis. They recorded his fever and immobility, but there were no signs of wounds, external injuries, or obvious disease vectors. The symptoms remain one of the most puzzling medical cases in history. Modern theories include typhoid fever, malaria, Guillain-Barré syndrome, and acute pancreatitis, all plausible but inconclusive. None explain the full 12-day duration, the intact body, or the sudden onset after the banquet. The most persistent theory remains poisoning. If poison was used, it had to be slow-acting. The Greek herbal poison veratrum album, white hellebore, matches many of the symptoms: vomiting, abdominal cramps, fever, low heart rate, weakness, gradual paralysis. It can kill over several days, mimicking disease. It was known in ancient medicine, and it could be hidden in wine. Some versions of the story suggest Iolaus, the cupbearer, delivered the poison, possibly on Antipater's orders. Others claim it was administered in stages. Alexander himself said nothing. No accusations, no suspects named. That silence may have been tactical, or the result of growing confusion. In the final days, visitors reported strange behavior. Alexander claimed to see divine signs. He asked to be buried in the Egyptian oracle city of Siwa, where he had once been told he was the son of Zeus. He refused all attempts to name an heir, saying only that his empire should go to the strongest. His body, once dead, didn't decay for 6 days. Some said it was proof of divinity. Others said it was a result of poison that halted decomposition. There was no official autopsy. The corpse was placed in a gold sarcophagus, then taken for burial. But even his final resting place would be disputed. Stolen, moved, fought over, and the court he left behind, the one full of generals, cupbearers, and wives, was already breaking apart. But even in death, Alexander would keep causing conflict, as his empty throne became the most dangerous seat in the world. As his body failed, Alexander refused to name a successor. His generals begged him to speak. They gathered in his chamber, asking who should take the throne. He whispered something. Some claimed he said, "To the strongest." Others heard nothing at all. The silence became a battlefield. He passed his signet ring to Perdiccas, a high-ranking general. But this was not a clear command. It created confusion. Was Perdiccas meant to rule, to protect the unborn child of Roxana, Alexander's wife, or simply to manage things until a proper heir could be chosen? No one knew. And Alexander gave no further instructions. According to eyewitnesses, in his final hours, he allowed his troops to pass by his bed. Thousands of men filed in silently to see their dying king. He could no longer speak. He looked at them and moved his eyes. That was all. His final request, according to some reports, was to be buried in Egypt, at the oracle of Siwa, where priests had once declared him the son of Zeus Ammon. He believed this would confirm his divine identity even in death. His mind, at the end, may not have been clear. Reports describe hallucinations, strange gestures, and prolonged silences. Some believed he was poisoned. Others believed his body was already shutting down from disease, exhaustion, or neurological collapse. But even in death, control was slipping from his hands. The day he died, no one was ready. No heir was crowned. No future was secured. His wives were pregnant, but their children were unborn. His generals were powerful, but divided. The court was full of whispers, and the moment his breathing stopped, the empire he built began to fracture. No one wept publicly. No one took the crown. They didn't know who would live long enough to claim it. But before the power vacuum became a war, there was one final move: the fate of his body, and the battle to own the symbol of his legacy. The day Alexander died, his empire had no ruler, no plan, and no unity. His generals, known as the Diadochi, immediately began maneuvering for control. The most powerful among them were Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antipater, and Cassander. None had a clear claim to the throne, but each had armies, each had territory, and none trusted the others. Perdiccas tried to act as regent. He announced that Roxana, Alexander's wife, was pregnant, and that if the child were a boy, he would be king. The court agreed, reluctantly, but this was not a long-term solution. Meanwhile, Ptolemy made his move. Instead of obeying the royal plan to bury Alexander in Macedonia, Ptolemy hijacked the funeral procession. He intercepted the gold sarcophagus and brought the body to Egypt. He believed that controlling the dead king's remains would give him legitimacy. It worked. Alexander's tomb became a site of pilgrimage. Ptolemy built a new dynasty from that moment, the Ptolemaic line that would last for 300 years and end with Cleopatra. Back in Babylon, Infighting erupted. Perdiccas was assassinated. Roxana murdered Alexander's other wife, Statira, and possibly her sister. She wanted no rival heirs. She later gave birth to a boy, Alexander IV, who was declared king in name, but was quickly made a puppet. Cassander, the son of Antipater, would later have both Roxana and the young Alexander IV killed to clear his path to power. One by one, the empire split. The wars of the Diadochi lasted for decades. The unified empire became fragments, ruled by generals who once called themselves brothers in arms. Alliances changed constantly. Assassinations became common. Thousands died. Alexander's vision of a united world, Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and beyond, collapsed within months. His body was buried in a golden coffin in a city he never ruled while alive. His son was buried in secret, decades later, with no kingdom and no throne. But how do historians make sense of such a collapse? And how do they explain a death that still has no clear cause? For more than 2,000 years, historians have tried to explain how Alexander the Great died. And to this day, there is no agreement. Writers from the ancient world, like Plutarch, Arrian, and Diodorus Siculus, recorded his final days with vivid detail, but they wrote their accounts centuries later, using sources that no longer exist, and often contradicting each other. Many accepted the idea that his death came from natural causes. Typhoid fever was long believed to be the most likely. It could explain the fever, the abdominal pain, and the slow decline. Some leaned toward malaria, considering the climate in Babylon. Others, in recent years, have suggested more complex neurological breakdowns, like Guillain-Barré syndrome or an autoimmune collapse brought on by exhaustion and stress. But none of these fully explain the exact sequence of symptoms or how his body remained preserved for days. That mystery, how his corpse showed no decay, has fueled continued belief in poisoning. In 2014, a group of toxicologists proposed that a plant known as Veratrum album, or white hellebore, may have been used. It was known in the ancient world and could mimic the signs of a slow illness. The symptoms fit: nausea, weakness, low pulse, muscle failure. It also could explain the lack of decomposition if his system shut down in a particular way. But there is no direct proof, only matching symptoms and historical speculation. There were also powerful motives. Alexander's growing mistrust, his erratic behavior, and his silence about succession all made him a threat. Some modern scholars point to Antipater, the regent of Macedon, who had reason to fear Alexander's return. His son Iolaus, who served Alexander wine during his final banquet, was in a perfect position to deliver poison. Olympias, Alexander's mother, believed this story so strongly that she desecrated Iolaus's grave years later in revenge. Roman writers repeated the theory, but the ancient sources are scattered, and there's no evidence strong enough to convict anyone. Some historians argue the poisoning theory came later, built up as myth to explain the chaos that followed his death. Others believe the circumstances are just too strange to ignore. No one can say for certain. There was no autopsy, no medical record, no confession. Only a silence that has lasted for centuries. Alexander the Great changed the map of the world before he turned 30. He built an empire from Greece to India, defeated the most powerful armies of his time, and left cities behind that still exist today. But for all his victories, his empire didn't survive him. It collapsed almost instantly. His death exposed something simple and brutal. The empire wasn't built to last. It was built around one man's ambition. There were no institutions strong enough to hold it together, no legal system to support succession, no shared vision beyond conquest. Alexander had wanted to fuse East and West. He believed he could unite Greeks and Persians, soldiers and scholars, kings and gods. He wore Persian robes, married foreign queens, and tried to convince his men to see all people as one. But his own army never truly accepted this vision. The unity he forced in public never existed in private, and when he died, Everything he created broke apart. The wars of succession tore through his former empire for decades. His generals betrayed one another. His family was wiped out. The dream of a world empire disappeared under competing kingdoms, drawn by blood and greed. But something remained. His name became legend. His tactics were studied for centuries. His image appeared in 3 continents. Leaders across history, Caesar, Napoleon, even modern generals, called him the greatest military mind who ever lived. But behind that image is a deeper question. Was Alexander a visionary or just a brilliant destroyer? He never built a stable government. He never returned home. He left behind no clear law, no strong institution, no enduring peace. The world he left was more divided than the one he found. He was a man who won every battle, but may have lost the war for legacy. And the way he died, quietly, slowly, possibly poisoned by someone in his own court, reveals how fragile even the most powerful ruler can become. In the end, the boy raised to be a god died like a mortal, alone, surrounded by silence, and remembered, not for how he lived, but for how quickly everything he built fell apart. The greatest conqueror in history left behind nothing that lasted. No heir, no empire, no peace. Just a body that wouldn't rot, a war that never ended, and a death that still can't be explained. But Alexander's story isn't the only one like this. Across history, power has built empires and then destroyed the people who held it. So the question is, how many more like him are there? How many rulers rose too fast, trusted too little, and vanished just as violently? That's what we're uncovering, story by story, and the next one might be even darker.